to another STARS webinar. I am David Earn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as geopolitics, leadership, technology, climate change, and health. A select group of people is attending today's webinar live, and hundreds more watch the recording later on. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Andrew Williamson about the state of the play in the global race for connectivity and the role of ICT and technologies like 5G as the backbone of the digital economy. Andrew is currently Vice President and Economic Advisor of the Government Affairs team at Huawei Technologies. In this role, he is a key aide on global macroeconomic, political, and industry trends. Andrew's research also involves the contribution ICT makes to economic growth and society. Before joining Huawei, he was chief economist at Dun & Bradstreet and global leader of its country risk department. Andrew previously held a number of roles at the Economist Intelligence Unit, including Global Director of Economic Research and Deputy Director of Country Forecasting. He began his career in the British Diplomatic Service. Good afternoon, Andrew. Good to see you, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Shenzhen. I'm delighted to be here.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Andrew. As usual, I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Andrew, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Since 2015, Huawei has published the Global Connectivity Index, GCI in short, which measures the ICT maturity of economies around the world. Before we talk about its latest findings, can you please start by giving us some background on what the Global Connectivity Index is, how it measures ICT maturity, and why this is important?
Thank you. So what is it, the Global Connectivity Index? Well, it's our contribution really to quantifying progress in digital transformation. Now, there are a number of studies that are done around the world. Actually, the World Economic Forum did one for many years, the Network Readiness Index. Actually, they stopped doing that in 2016, but that was a useful reference guide. The ITU as well produces something called the ICT Development Index. And of course, within the European Union, we have the DESI, the Digital Economy and Society Index. But one of the features of a lot of these indexes is that they are very backward looking. They mostly focused on network infrastructure, also brought in features of and measures of human capital that were, covered in lots of other types of indexes. So in our discussions with government stakeholders, industry stakeholders, others, we wanted to produce an index that we thought was much more forward-looking in its assessments, using the very latest technologies like cloud computing, artificial intelligence. And we partnered with IDC, the digital economy experts, data experts, to produce that index. So that's really just, a very quick introduction as to why we did it, because we just knew that there was a real audience that wanted consistent measures, forward-looking measures that could really overall measure progress that the countries were making in very important factors of the digital economy. Very quickly, there are 50 indicators within the GCI. They are grouped thematically by supply, demand, experience, and potential. And then we have those four main technology groups that run across each of those pillars as well. These are broadband, mobile and fixed, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence.
If we look at the latest edition of the GCI, which was compiled during the COVID-19 pandemic, what are the three most important findings of the report, and how have they been shaped by the pandemic?
Yes, well, we actually took the opportunity to kind of do a retrospective. We went back to the first incarnations of the GCI and looked at the progress over those over the seven years. And there was some really good news. First of all, we group countries really into three main bands. Let me just talk about that very quickly, because we found a really interesting finding a few years back. We found that S curve that's often talked about in terms of technology development. And what the S curve showed is that there were very different returns to investment, returns to scale from digital transformation. So the first group are really the kind of the ICT novices. We call them the starter nations. The most interesting group is probably the adopters, okay, and that's a very wide band. Now, those are where the S curve starts to move up quite rapidly. So there are big increasing returns to scale of GCI score against GDP per capita. Then you have the front runner countries, the familiar advanced economies that are really at the technological frontier. But what we found looking back is actually the starter group had increased their average scores at the fastest rate since we started the GCI. And of course, that's mostly a catch-up story. Then it was adopters, and then finally front runners. So there's good news in terms of front runners are catching up to digital leaders, and a lot of that was about diffusion and take up of 4G, mobile broadband subscriptions, lots of investment in infrastructure, but also a reduction in cost savings. So that was really good news. The second major finding that we had this year is that we also saw within those different country groups that the expected decline in economic growth for 2020 was the lowest for the front runner groups, and then falling back to adopters and then the starter group. Now, we can surmise from that that maybe digital transformation, digital sophistication and capability was softening the blow, the economic shock of COVID-19. Intuitively, that kind of makes sense. We know that because of digital technologies, many more of us were fortunate in the advanced economies to be able to continue to work at home, to order goods and services online, have our children educated, etc. So there is a tentative case there that shows digital transformation also helped with resilience. And then finally, we saw something that was a little bit of more of a warning from our partners IDC, who were running this COVID survey continuously through 2020. And it showed that actually businesses were cutting back investment in quite large terms, but the front runner nations were cutting their IT budgets much less than adopter and starter nations. So really, it was a call for action. It was a warning to countries, to businesses, that perhaps this wasn't a wise decision. We all understand that under economic pressure that companies were facing, there has to be cuts in budgets, but cutting IT budgets was probably the worst thing that they could be doing.
COVID-19 has made digital transformation an urgent priority for every economy. From your perspective, what does the new normal look like? What technologies do you believe will drive economic growth in the near future?
So I think, we're at the tentative start, we hope, to this to a return to normality, a turn to economic recovery. I think many things will return to how they were, but there's definitely a case that many things have also changed permanently. So we know this great migration to the home looks very sticky. Many people, many companies are now allowing workers to work at home full time, or at best they're calling people back into the office for 2-3 days a week. So that's a big change. We know that there were very large leaps in e-commerce. UK is a good example. UK was a leader in terms of e-commerce as a percentage of overall retail. It had been on an upwards trend to about 20%, leapt last year into the low 30s. Now, that doesn't look like it's falling back. There has been a structural change. We've all heard this term of COVID-19 created this big acceleration in digital transformation. In many industries, this looks to be true. Now, what are those transformative technologies? Well, there's a lot of excitement in economics around this term general purpose technologies. These are the very rare technologies like steam engines, electrification, come along very rarely in economic history. And it looks like task-specific artificial intelligence, cloud computing, 5G, the Internet of Things, these all look like the type of technologies that can be hugely impactful and impact on all industries, essentially. That's how you define the general purpose nature of them. But I think what's more interesting is that they don't work in isolation. The most powerful aspect of these technologies is when they work together symbiotically. And we think there's evidence for this already with 5G, machine learning, data analytics, artificial intelligence, if you like, and the Internet of Things. And Huawei partnering with industry leaders is combining those technologies, especially manufacturing, for example, just using 5G and high definition video and artificial intelligence to really greatly improve efficiency in quality checking. It could be microchips, it can be aircraft fuselage, it can be many other different products. We're seeing huge leaps in productivity improvements there, 300%. The use of those technologies in ports, this term smart ports, is seeing big transformations in taking crane drivers out of cranes, putting them in a much nicer office environment, allowing them to operate, skilled operators, 2-3 cranes at a time. You're seeing efficiency improvements of around 20%. In smart mining in China, these technologies are meaning that workers have to spend 50% less of their time underground in often very dangerous and unhealthy conditions. So we're not talking the kind of productivity improvements of 1-2% that we've been experiencing for several decades. We're talking about radical changes in overall productivity. And I think that's where the secret will be, how you combine those technologies together.
I'd like to briefly return to the Keysight ranking before we open up the discussion. The Keysight tracks the digital development of 79 nations, which account for 95% of global GDP. Can you talk us through the country rankings? What is the state of play in this global race, really, for connectivity?
Yes, well, what can I say? We were talking earlier before we went online. I made a joke when I was working at The Economist. We would always know if a ranking was working if Switzerland and the Scandinavian countries were at the top. It's the only way you could really check with the quick run through of the numbers. So that's the case here. It looks like it's a very robust index. The good news over time, as I mentioned earlier, is actually that the starter nations are catching up. There is a catch-up story here. There's growing evidence of this increasing returns to scale in the adopter group of nations. But I think overall, there's no great surprise in those rankings in terms of the front-runner countries. There haven't been that much change in the overall rankings over time. I think the big stories really, though, over time has been the rapid improvement of countries like United Arab Emirates and China. Now, those are the ones that have really leapt up the rankings, Malaysia, Thailand as well to an extent. Actually, they are also a story of big government support. Wise governments that have seen the future, if you like, in terms of digital transformation, have been very active in providing support to their private sector, and also creating a bigger role for e-government to be a big procurer of these types of services. So overall, we're very happy with the index. There are good stories in there, as I say, but if you look at the rankings overall, there's no deep surprises in terms of the overall country placement.
We have a question from the audience, and the question comes from Kapil Rekni. He's a STARS alumnus and the executive director of the Advanced College of Engineering and Management in Kathmandu. He writes, I did not find much of a difference between 3G and 4G technology, but I hear that there is a paradigm shift between 4G and 5G. If so, what are the big changes?
So it's a great question, and we could talk for hours on this. I often have to listen to the engineers talk about. But quickly, there was a big change actually, 3G to 4G. If you think of companies like Uber, those types of technologies that use mobile internet could not have existed without the combination of smartphones, 4G technology, GPS. Simply couldn't happen. So the mobile platform internet is really one that's based on the capabilities of 5G. But 5G really is a paradigm shift. It's often talked about in terms of the improvement of speed. That's something that we've got used to in the kind of the ICT industry, the digital economy. But really, the two other aspects of 5G are the most profound. That is in terms of capacity. Okay, so previously when we have a 4G network, it's the maximum of connections that you can have to smartphone devices is about 40,000, 50,000. You would have experienced that in, say, a football stadium or a cricket stadium, where it's actually quite hard to send a text or connect to the base station antennae system. With 5G, we connect millions of devices. That's what's unlocked all this talk of the Internet of Things. You can have many hundreds of thousands of machines talking to each other, talking to the cloud. And then the next one is about latency. So we're all used to the kind of the buffering in video or other aspects of mobile internet. With 5G, we almost eradicate latency. So again, it's a kind of a turnkey technological development. And that's why there's much more excitement now about autonomous vehicles or vehicles being able to speak to each other and be connected on the network, because having any sort of delay in terms of latency of information packet sending could be disastrous at a junction if cars were driving around and that buffering was to occur. So that's in summary, the big transformative effects that 5G will have.
In your role as economic advisor, you closely follow global macroeconomic, political, and industry trends. What major trends do you see across these three areas, and how do they affect Huawei?
So and they're big topics. They're very broad. I'm basically covering almost everything, apart from medicine and no. So I think actually in macroeconomics is going through a fascinating period, something that you really wait decades for. I think what's become very apparent is this big change in terms of thinking about the role of government. We saw after the great financial crisis this move to austerity. There was some move to kind of helping the economy through fiscal stimulus, but it was pulled away in retrospect far too rapidly. So this time round, governments have come out with huge largesse. They know it's really important that they play a much bigger role. And moving forward now, after the kind of the emergency options that were put in place, we're seeing big new ideas, big infrastructure programs coming out of the US, other countries to support future growth. So that's really interesting, that kind of role of government, almost the true return of Keynesian economics. I think that's a really interesting development in macroeconomics. The next big interesting thing in macroeconomics is really about the productivity puzzle. So although we've had this big long period of technological development, it feels like we've really been developing lots of high tech. The productivity improvements overall globally have been quite disappointing. So there's lots of debate about why this has occurred. And actually, the likes of Erik Brynjolfsson at MIT probably seem to have the best answer, which is it takes society a long time to digest these new super general purpose technologies, just as what occurred with electrification and the steam engine. It can take a long time for that to then come through. We have to rethink the way we do business. We have to reshape our factories, etc. So there is growing optimism that actually this decade, because of the combination of these new technologies like 5G, AI, cloud computing, that a productivity revolution could well occur this decade. So all of that is really interesting. And of course, this kind of idea of Schumpeterian creative destruction, the shock that we had with COVID-19, this great acceleration digital transformation as well, means that lots of new business models are tentatively appearing. And actually, recessions are often a great period for the new businesses to form. It's counterintuitive, but lots of innovation actually happens in those periods. Then politics, clearly we are going through difficult times in terms of globalism. I think, the big political trends of recent years have been this kind of this lurch to populism, this lurch to nativism. That doesn't look like it's going to recede soon. Unfortunately, there's a lot more distrust as well. Internationally, there's a kind of a weakness, a vacuum with multilateral organizations. So you've got to be optimistic about these things as well. I think politically there is a growing call for perhaps a digital Bretton Woods. There's a call for a WTO 2.0. There's something we don't want this necessarily to keep running through. It will be very destructive. It took decades to build up globalization, global value chains to all our benefit, really, and it would be very unfortunate if that was allowed to fall away. And then quickly on the industry side, I think clearly tech sector dominance is here to stay. I mean, as I'm trying to say, that we do look like we're going through new paradigms, a big shake-up of industry, of the economy. We've seen that in the share prices, but I think something that will happen maybe over this decade is that we might have hit peak big tech, if you like. It's a controversial view, but I think there is an awareness and a push that a lot of the value add in digital transformation is going to too few giant companies. And there has to be much more that's done to equitably share the value that's created from digital transformation. So hopefully you're going to see a rise of digital ecosystems. Some countries have been much better at kind of fighting back against the big e-commerce giants, etc. There's lots of exciting startup action, venture capital that's happening in the Asia Pacific region, as I'm sure a lot of this audience is aware of. So I think that might be a big new trend as well in terms of the industry. And then, as I've been mentioning before, I think, will we solve this productivity puzzle? And it looks like there are tentative signs that yes, there is a real productivity revolution that's happening in industry and in the service sector as well, which is happening through a combination of these different general purpose technologies.
You mentioned the idea of a digital Bretton Woods. So what is your view on tech decoupling? How real is it, and is it here to stay? So
in some aspects, yes, tech decoupling is happening. The barriers to purchasing of chips, semiconductors, we've seen that is causing a lot of disruption. In fact, one of the unintended consequences of politics targeting parts of sophisticated, complicated global value chains in the tech sector has been this problem with sourcing semiconductors. At the same time, there is a lot of talk about this, but I was reading just today in the Financial Times that Apple seems to have deepened its value chain in China. So there's clearly some aspects of that tech decoupling that's happening, and in other areas it clearly isn't yet. But I think the risk of this fragmentation is very real, and that's why I find this idea that was proposed by the IMF really interesting. That it's we are at a point in time where perhaps the private sector technology has run well ahead of the policymakers, and there's we are very supportive of this idea of calling together all stakeholders to really thrash out the situation on cyber security, on technology value chains, etc., to really set the standards and rules for a global industry.
We have a follow-up question from Toni Schönenberger, the executive chairman of STARS, about the previous discussion on 3G, 4G, 5G. He would like to know, when does 6G arrive?
Well, I can't give an exact date to the day, but what I do know is that these technologies have a long R&D period. And it's normally about 11, 12 years. If you think back to the different phones that if you're old enough, you can go all the way back to 2G. It does seem to be a kind of a decadal type cycle. We have already been investing and researching 6G capabilities. Now, at the moment, though, the standards haven't been set. They are always set globally, as they were with 5G. So you have to set the kind of parameters and the technology that will be distinguished by 6G, and it will be, largely those three main metrics that I mentioned before: speed, capacity, and latency. But what I do know is that it looks like a very sci-fi type world in terms of we are talking moving to petabyte capability of download speeds. We are looking at total eradication of latency, and we are then scaling up to the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of devices. So you enter a world where it's almost becoming seamless between the digital sphere and the real world. We'll have full augmented reality, virtual reality, those types of capabilities. So we're looking maybe, I would suspect, I think we're talking 2035.
Let's talk about R&D for a bit. According to the EU's latest research and development scorecard, 3 of the top 5 companies in the world, in terms of their overall R&D investment, are American tech companies: Amazon, Alphabet, and Microsoft. Huawei is 4th. In what areas is Huawei spending most of its R&D budget, and where will Huawei put its focus in the next few years?
So we mostly still invest in our main product categories. Okay, so there's it will be continuous research and development in our consumer products, our device business group. It will continue to be in 5G, elements of 6G that we are testing. And also we're doing lots as well in terms of cloud computing capabilities. That will represent about 80%. Actually, a big change at the company just a couple of years ago was this idea, what we call Innovation 2.0. And we are looking to spend about 20% of our total R&D budget in basic science, basic research. And the reason behind that, that's the kind of blue sky fundamental research that happens without any kind of commercial application goal at the end of it. Because we're really inspired. We think that a lot of the breakthroughs in science that happened for the technology industry are actually quite old now, and we're hitting buffers in terms of capabilities and development to take us to the next level. Quantum computing, for example, will be a very important symbiotic technology with 6G. So we have to try and invest and make big breakthroughs in those types of areas as well.
These technologies, broadband, cloud, AI, IoT, and so on, they require a lot of energy. What can be done to reduce the carbon footprint of the ICT industry on the environment?
So the simple answer is research and development. And actually, Huawei has been at the forefront of the industry. If you look at these measures that you get from the likes of Gartner, IDC, we were really innovative in terms of water cooling in big server devices, in big server farms. Other innovations to try and through chip technology to reduce the energy footprint. So in terms of capability, there has been a really unknown good news story that in terms of computing capability, we have been really reducing the carbon footprint. Unfortunately, though, of course, the needs of computer generation, data creation and analytics is running alongside that. So the kind of the best that we're getting at the moment is a kind of a flattening. But in terms of 5G as well, again, it's a similar story. It's far more efficient in terms of sending those ones and zeros around from our devices back to the base station. So we've hit improvements of 10 times in terms of what we can do. So, this is just the start. Overall, the industry is very aware of this and is consistently innovating in ways to try and reduce its overall energy needs and requirements.
Huawei has recently lost growth from its core telecommunications hardware enterprise. So what do you see as the next level for Huawei in the next 5 years?
So we are moving into exciting new areas. We were last year the second biggest provider of cloud computing services and capabilities in China. We've really come on leaps and bounds in terms of our technology capabilities, our service capabilities. Goes back to the question about energy consumption. We've at the forefront of that. It's the major cost for our customers. So we keep innovating at that frontier to make us very cost competitive. Recently been announced as well, just to finish off, we are getting into the electric vehicle industry. We're not currently planning to build our own car, but we're partnering with a number of manufacturers, and we see ourselves as very capable supplier in terms of key components. It could be the LiDAR technology, it can be the camera technology, it can be the computing capabilities on board that stem out from our consumer durable business. So these are new areas. Huawei's always innovating. It will always find new ways, new sources of revenue, I'm sure of that.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Andrew, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I would also like to thank all our alumni who tuned in today. In the next STARS webinar on the 10th of June, Mamata Chamorti, Head of Software Business and Product Management at Stellantis, the world's 4th largest automaker, shares her view on trends that will shape the future of mobility. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.